I think there's going to be a not insignificant number of people who watch this, go back and revisit Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, and think to themselves, maybe this one wasn't so bad after all. And I just sent a chill down a lot of your spines. Alright, before we get started, as always, a quick thank you to my patron over on Patreon, and if you enjoy the content I make and would like to offer your support, for as little as $1 a month, you can get your name listed right here at the start of every video. Link is in the description below. And now, let's get into the actual review.
But I've been looking for this all my life.
Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny is the fifth and probably final entry in the Indiana Jones franchise. Taking place in 1969, Indiana Jones, played by Harrison Ford, is set to retire from teaching, but his goddaughter, played by Phoebe Waller-Bridge, comes to him asking for his help to search for an ancient artifact called the Dial of Destiny that supposedly has the ability to travel through time. And also on the hunt for said dial is a former Nazi soldier played by Mads Mikkelsen, who wants the dial for his own diabolical purposes. You want me to summarize my feelings for this film in a single sentence? This doesn't feel like an Indiana Jones movie. This feels like someone trying to do an imitation of an Indiana Jones movie. Pretty much every single issue I have with this film can be traced back to that one singular problem. Yeah, Harrison Ford is back playing Indiana Jones, and yes, the name Indiana Jones is on the title, and yes, they do play the iconic John Williams music at key pivotal scenes. But at the end of the day, when I was done watching it, I looked back on it and thought to myself, that didn't really feel like an Indiana Jones movie at all. Indy as a character just doesn't feel like himself, which I would actually be okay with if that was the point. Like, if they were kind of going for a deconstruction of the character. But the movie almost doesn't seem to know if it wants to be one last hurrah of Indiana Jones in an old-fashioned adventure story, or if it wants to be a deconstruction of that idea, with older Indiana Jones feeling like he's out of his depth with everyone else around him. The idea could have been decent if it was fully explored, but instead this movie kind of seems like it wants to do a little bit of both. But by doing so, it doesn't really commit to either one of these ideas, so the entire film just feels kinda half-baked. To be frank, it doesn't help that director James Mangold doesn't really know how to stage an action scene like an Indiana Jones movie. Some of his individual action shots are fine, but he struggles with the actual scale of the action and in ratcheting up the tension so that you feel like the characters might actually be in danger. In particular, he seems really clueless about how to stage an action scene that takes place when it's dark, like at night, or in the sea. And really, the action here feels so sanitized and clean, and that feels like a Disney problem in particular. Nope, can't have this one be too dark because that would clash with our family-friendly image. But this sanitization means that none of the imagery or action set pieces stand out at all. The other Indiana Jones films had elements that really stuck with me. Raiders had the face-melting scenes, Temple of Doom had the heart-removing scene, Last Crusade had the wrapping aging scene, Crystal Skull had the ant scene. But this film? I can't really say any of the moments or pieces of imagery in this film will stick with me at all. Maybe the one single shot of a bunch of eels crawling out of a human skeleton, but that's it. This film is shot so standard that it doesn't feel like there was much effort into making this film stand out as an Indiana Jones film. Speaking of imagery, we might as well talk about the opening scene that takes place in 1939, and in which they used digital de-aging effects to make Harrison Ford look 40 years younger. Now, I will admit, at first I thought it looked like a decent effect. It was kinda sorta okay at first, as long as you didn't look at it that hard, but the longer we're forced to spend looking at the effect, the more rubbery it starts to look, and at times even looks like a video game character from a cutscene. Definitely not Flash bad, but still not great. I should also take this opportunity to mention that this film cost $300 million. I genuinely have no idea where all that money went, unless de-aging someone really is just that expensive. And speaking of the de-aging, it also doesn't help that when the character speaks, you can clearly tell that it's the elderly Harrison Ford voice. So yeah, that was really jarring and distracting. But okay, not great effects are one thing. Sadly, the story's not all that engaging either. A lot of plot beats feel forced to move the story in a direction that the writers feel that it should. They'll build stuff up only to have it completely dropped by the end. Like, for instance, Indiana Jones at one point essentially goes on the run after being accused of murder, fugitive style. But absolutely nothing ever comes out of it. And by the end, it's completely forgotten about, even though realistically, it should still be a problem. And sometimes there are bizarre inconsistencies. Like, in one scene when Indy and Shaw are both in a cave filled with methane, she's coughing really badly and he's not suffering any kind of ill effects. Or sometimes they'll have characters do completely illogical things just for the sake of the plot. Like the CIA agent who witnesses someone who is supposed to be under her purview murdering innocent civilians without blinking an eye, and she not only doesn't immediately arrest him on the spot, but she just criticizes him like he was just a puppy who did a piddle on the carpet, and continues to work with him. And then there's things that I genuinely don't get why they're in the film. Near the end, one character hijacks a plane, and then we find out that there's a guy sleeping in the back of said plane. He wakes up, and that's it. He doesn't do anything, he doesn't add anything, and it's not really that funny. In fact, they don't even convey it like it's supposed to be a joke. So I genuinely don't know why he's there in the plane. Speaking of characters, let's talk about Helena Shaw for a second, played by Phoebe Waller-Bridge. This is the character that is very clearly trying to be set up as the kinda carry the torch character for this franchise going forward. And man, did I find her irritating. She's got this kind of smarmy attitude that the filmmakers think is really charming, and they are very wrong. And it doesn't help that she commits actions in the first half of the film that are actually pretty detestable. Or that she has some of the worst lines in the entire movie that feel like she's being used as a mouthpiece for one of the writers, like when she describes her own thievery as capitalism, or when she criticizes Indy as being a grave robber. Now, this isn't the worst instance of this kind of character ever, mainly because the character does improve a little bit in the second half, but let's just say that Waller-Bridge doesn't have the charisma to fully carry a franchise like this on her back, because honestly, she's not even that great in the deuteragonist role. There's also a kid sidekick character, Teddy, that is clearly supposed to be kind of like a short round type character. He's there. The villain played by Mads Mikkelsen was so boring. He's probably the least interesting indie villain we've ever had. He's not really that threatening, and nothing about his personality makes him stand out. And I was able to guess what his plan was about half an hour before it actually got revealed. Antonio Banderas appears in the movie, and his contribution is that he gets to be in the movie. And yeah, the third act of this film is not very good either. It takes a really bizarre turn in the climax that really doesn't feel properly earned, and then it just ends anticlimactically. I think they were trying to go with an ending similar to Raiders of the Lost Ark, kind of like a hoist them by their own petard kind of feel, but the difference between those films is that in Raiders it was properly built up, and still felt massive in scale, even though technically it was a deus ex machina, whilst in this film it was not properly built up, and it just feels like they're trying to just get the scene over with, so there's no sense of catharsis with the resolution. If by the end of your film it feels like you're trying to rush through it to get to the end, just imagine how the audience feels having to watch it. But when all is said and done, this film's biggest problem is that it's boring, which is not helped by the fact that this film has a runtime of 2.5 hours long. And my word, you can feel that length. There is absolutely no reason that this film needed to be 2.5 hours long. The pacing in this film drags, especially in the second act, when it feels like the same exact scenario is repeated over and over again with very little variation. So was there anything to actively like about this film? Well, the first 20 minutes that takes place in 1939 Nazi Germany was kinda okay. It kinda harkens back to an older era of cinema as we watch Indy just fight a bunch of Nazis. There were flickers of inspiration for what this film could have been that pop up here and there. There's one scene where one character dispatches a villain, and it's surprisingly kind of brutal, and it took me by surprise in a good way. I kind of enjoyed the bit of Indiana Jones riding on a horse throughout New York City, and I also kind of liked a little bit of the twist they do with Indy being scared of eels because they're very similar to snakes. But that aside, I'm really struggling to think of anything that actually stood out to me that went above what could be constituted the bare minimum. I don't know who's most at fault here, whether it was the Disney execs, or Kathleen Kennedy, or James Mangold, but I suspect it was some combination of the three. It doesn't feel like anybody was on the same page with this one. Now, is this film completely terrible? I'm not sure I can go that far. Namely because aside from a few elements, there's not really anything actively terrible in it. But I also can't name much about this film that I actively liked either. It kind of just feels like a nothing movie. A very hollow experience that won't leave any kind of impact. Everything about this film screams corporate product. I was really hoping this film would be better, or at the very least be passable enough for entertainment. And I kept waiting for that moment when the film would turn on, but it never came. I was mostly just bored by it. And if there's anything that an Indiana Jones movie should never be, it's boring. Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny gets a low, half-empty shot. I mean, Indiana Jones completionists will want to see it regardless, so my recommendation to those people is just wait for it to come out on Disney Plus if you're that curious. I wouldn't hate having to sit through this one again, but I can't think of a single reason why I should go back and revisit it. And I guess that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if you want to see my early thoughts of any film I watch or to read more of my reviews, make sure to check out my Letterboxd account. The link to that is in the description below. And make sure that you're subscribed so that you don't miss any upcoming reviews. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.